The chill of an autumn dawn, 910 AD, settled not just on the sodden earth of Mercia, but also on the ambitious hearts of two Anglo-Saxon kings, Edward, son of Alfred the Great, and Ethelred, the ealdorman of Mercia, stood at the precipice of what they believed would be a glorious dawn for their kingdoms, a dawn that would finally banish the shadow of Norse dominion from their shores. Their grand design, a meticulously planned campaign, was aimed squarely at the heart of the Danelaw, a vast territory carved out by generations of Viking settlement and conquest. The objective was singular, bold, and, in their eyes, divinely sanctioned: to reclaim their ancestral lands, to cleanse the soil of the foreign invaders, and to reassert the rightful authority of the Anglo-Saxon crown. They gathered an army, a host of formidable size, resplendent in polished mail, their banners snapping defiantly in the nascent breeze. Priests offered blessings, their voices carrying promises of divine favor, their words weaving a tapestry of righteous certainty. The air crackled with the potent, intoxicating mix of martial fervor and unwavering faith. This was not merely a military expedition, it was a crusade, a holy war waged against those they deemed heathens and usurpers. Their march was a procession of power, a testament to their collective might, a declaration that the era of Danish dominance was drawing to a decisive, ignominious close. They saw themselves as instruments of destiny, divinely chosen to restore order and prosperity, to usher in an age of renewed Saxon glory. The path ahead seemed clear, paved with the anticipated triumphs of their superior numbers and their God-given right. They were so utterly convinced of their impending victory, so blinded by the luminescence of their own perceived righteousness, that they failed to consider the most crucial element of any campaign: the enemy. Unseen, unheard, a different kind of certainty was brewing in the shadows of the very land they sought to conquer. The Vikings, far from being caught unawares by this formidable Anglo-Saxon host, had been watching, waiting, their movements as silent and deliberate as the encroaching twilight. They were not the disorganized, bloodthirsty raiders of popular imagination, but seasoned warriors who understood the ebb and flow of conflict, the subtle art of strategy, and the devastating power of patience. For years they had lived amongst these lands, learned their contours, their hidden paths, their vulnerabilities. They knew the rhythms of the Anglo-Saxon armies, their tendency towards pride, their reliance on brute force over cunning. And as Edward and Ethelred marshaled their forces, a different kind of plan was being woven, a plan born not of righteous fury, but of cold, calculated pragmatism. This was not a battle of kings against kings, but a clash of philosophies, of approaches to war itself. The Saxons marched with the arrogance of assured victory, their eyes fixed on the horizon of conquest, oblivious to the serpent coiled at their feet. The Vikings, meanwhile, moved with the quiet confidence of those who held the true advantage, their strategy a testament to their deep understanding of the land and the men who would soon tread upon it. They knew that the grand pronouncements and the gleaming armor of their enemies were no match for the stillness of the forest, the deceptive quiet of a well-laid trap, and the sheer, unadulterated ferocity of a people fighting for their very existence on foreign soil. The stage was set, not for a glorious charge, but for a devastating ambush, a stark lesson in the perils of underestimating an enemy who knew the ground better than they knew their own battle formations. The Anglo-Saxon kings, Edward and Ethelred, had meticulously assembled their legions, a veritable sea of steel and resolve, convinced that overwhelming force was the ultimate arbiter of conflict. Their war chests were full, their armor gleaming and their ranks bolstered by seasoned warriors, each man a testament to the martial heritage of their people. The accompanying clergy, their vestments a stark contrast to the grim practicality of the battlefield, offered prayers and blessings invoking celestial favor for their earthly endeavors. This spiritual reinforcement was not merely symbolic. It was intended to solidify the morale of the troops, to imbue them with a sense of divine mandate, and to foster an unshakable conviction in the righteousness of their cause. Every march was accompanied by the clang of steel, the rhythmic thud of marching feet, and the fervent chants of men who believed themselves to be on the cusp of a divinely ordained victory. They had studied maps, planned routes, and calculated troop movements with a precision that, on the surface, suggested a mastery of military science. However, this mastery was rooted in a flawed premise: that the enemy would conform to their expectations, that the battlefield would unfold according to their preordained script. Their strategic vision, while extensive, was fundamentally myopic, focused entirely on the projection of their own power, rather than an acute understanding of the adversary's capabilities and motivations. They saw the looming conflict as a continuation of past struggles, a predictable clash of armies where sheer numbers and martial prowess would inevitably prevail. This ingrained belief in their own superiority, a potent brew of regal entitlement and historical precedent, served as a potent blindfold, obscuring the more subtle yet ultimately decisive factors at play. Conversely, the Viking war leaders, operating from the periphery of the Anglo-Saxon perception, were engaged in a different kind of preparation, one that eschewed grand pronouncements and ostentatious displays of might. Their strength lay not in the vastness of their numbers or the polish of their weaponry, but in their profound attunement to the land itself and an almost preternatural understanding of their opponent's psychological landscape. They had not merely observed the Anglo-Saxon army's approach, they had anticipated it, dissected its likely trajectory, and identified the inherent vulnerabilities within its imposing structure. Their intelligence gathering was not the domain of formal scouts and messengers, but a pervasive network of observation, leveraging the intimate knowledge of the terrain held by those who had long called it home. They understood that the Anglo-Saxon reliance on a direct, frontal assault was a predictable pattern, a weakness that could be exploited with devastating effect. Instead of preparing to meet force with equal force in an open field, they meticulously cultivated an environment of deception and ambush. The dense woodlands, the winding river valleys, the very topography that the Anglo-Saxons considered mere obstacles on their path to glory, were to the Vikings crucial elements of their tactical design. They recognized that the psychological state of the invading army, its confidence bordering on hubris, was as much a weapon to be leveraged as any axe or spear. This deep-seated understanding allowed them to craft a strategy that was not about winning a pitched battle, but about orchestrating a catastrophic collapse, a carefully managed unraveling of the enemy's resolve and their physical capacity to resist. They were not merely preparing for a fight, they were setting a meticulously designed snare. The Vikings, masters of their chosen terrain, did not simply wait in the woods, they became one with them. Their intelligence was not derived from spies in enemy camps, but from a profound, almost instinctual understanding of the natural world, a skill honed by generations of survival and warfare in Scandinavia's rugged landscapes. Picture this: the Anglo-Saxon army, a lumbering behemoth marching through the dappled sunlight of the Mercian countryside. To the Vikings, hidden behind ancient oaks and dense thickets, this was not just a forest. It was a strategic ally, a living, breathing entity that offered concealment, choke points, and opportunities for devastating surprise. They had spent weeks, perhaps months, observing the enemy's movements, noting their routines, the times they were most vulnerable, and the routes they were most likely to take. This wasn't the abstract planning of a general in a war room. It was the intimate knowledge of a hunter who knows the habits of his prey. Imagine a wolf pack, silent and unseen, patiently tracking a herd, waiting for the opportune moment when an individual strays from the safety of the group. The Vikings employed a similar primal strategy, their patience as sharp as their blades. They understood that the Anglo-Saxons, accustomed to the more open battlefields of their own territories, would be disoriented and vulnerable in this unfamiliar, densely wooded environment. Furthermore, their tactical approach was a stark contrast to the Anglo-Saxon reliance on direct engagement. While the kings envisioned a glorious clash of shields and a test of martial strength in an open field, the Vikings prepared for a surgical strike, a dismemberment of the enemy's organized force before it could fully deploy. Consider the concept of a river, a powerful force capable of carving canyons and shaping landscapes. The Vikings intended to be that river, but instead of carving stone, they aimed to carve through the Anglo-Saxon ranks, using the terrain to amplify their impact. They chose the precise moment of exhaustion, the nadir of the enemy's morale, to unleash their fury. As the Anglo-Saxon soldiers, weary from their march and perhaps lulled into a false sense of security by the seemingly uneventful journey, paused to rest and refresh themselves in the heat of the day, the Vikings struck. This wasn't a battlefield where formations could be maintained. It was a chaotic melee, initiated with a ferocity that shattered any semblance of order. The ambush was not merely a surprise attack. It was an orchestrated descent into pandemonium, designed to exploit the psychological shock of an enemy that believed itself to be in control. The Vikings understood that panic is a contagion, and they were eager to spread it. Building on this understanding of terrain and timing, the Viking strategy was deeply rooted in the principle of asymmetric warfare, a concept far removed from the kingly notions of honor and direct confrontation. They were not seeking to defeat the Anglo-Saxon army in a conventional sense. They were aiming to annihilate its leadership and its most formidable fighting elements, thereby crippling the entire invasion effort. Picture the intricate workings of a clock. Each gear and spring plays a vital role in its overall function. The Vikings identified the most crucial gears within the Anglo-Saxon war machine: the kings, the nobles, the elite warriors, and targeted them with a relentless, focused assault. Their objective was not to capture territory in this instance, but to dismantle the very structure of the invasion. They knew that by striking at the head, the body would inevitably collapse. This was a war fought not just with steel, but with psychological warfare, with the deliberate sowing of terror and despair. The speed and ferocity of the initial onslaught were designed to overwhelm, to prevent any organized counterattack, and to ensure that the Anglo-Saxon army, so confident moments before, would be reduced to a scattered, terrified mob. The very elements that the Anglo-Saxons had overlooked, the dense foliage, the uneven ground, the oppressive heat, became the Vikings' most potent weapons, transforming a planned invasion into a swift, brutal extermination. The Anglo-Saxon kings, blinded by their perceived mandate and the sheer scale of their assembled might, marched with a profound underestimation of their foes' adaptability and their own inherent logistical weaknesses. They envisioned a straightforward conquest, a decisive battle of attrition where their superior numbers would simply wear down the defenders. However, they failed to account for the intricate web of supply lines and communication that such a large army required, vulnerabilities that the Vikings, with their decentralized command and intimate knowledge of the terrain, could easily exploit. Consider the analogy of a great river, powerful, seemingly unstoppable, but reliant on its tributaries for sustenance. The Anglo-Saxon army, stretching for miles across the countryside, was a vast logistical undertaking. Each mile traversed meant more mouths to feed, more horses to water, more equipment to maintain. A small agile raiding party, operating with swiftness and surprise, could disrupt these vital arteries with relative ease, creating a ripple effect of deprivation and disorganization far behind the front lines. The Vikings, by contrast, operated with a remarkable degree of self-sufficiency, their needs adapted to the land they knew so well. They could subsist on foraged goods, hunt game, and move with a speed that rendered their supply lines almost invisible to the enemy. This fundamental difference in operational logistics meant that while the Anglo-Saxons were burdened by their own immensity, the Vikings were unburdened, free to strike at will and melt away before a cohesive response could be mounted. Furthermore, the deeply ingrained hierarchical structure of the Anglo-Saxon military, while providing order in conventional warfare, proved to be a critical liability in the face of a decentralized, unpredictable assault. Orders flowed from the kings down through a chain of command, a process that, while ensuring discipline, also introduced significant delays in response to rapidly evolving battlefield conditions. Imagine a complex automaton, designed for precise movements but slow to react to unexpected stimuli. When the initial shock of the ambush struck, the need for clear communication and swift adaptation was paramount. However, the very system designed for order became a conduit for chaos. Messages had to be relayed, decisions ratified, and commands disseminated, all while under a relentless, disorienting attack. This lag time allowed the Vikings to inflict maximum damage before any coherent counter-strategy could be formulated or implemented. The Viking approach, conversely, was characterized by a greater degree of battlefield autonomy for their warriors and smaller units. While a chieftain would direct the overall engagement, individual fighters and groups possessed the freedom to exploit immediate opportunities and adapt to the fluid nature of the combat. This decentralized command structure, born of their own tribal traditions and the nature of their warfare, allowed for a far more dynamic and responsive engagement. They could swarm, retreat, regroup, and attack from multiple vectors with a speed that the Anglo-Saxons, bound by their rigid protocols, simply could not match. Another crucial layer to consider is the psychological impact of an unforeseen and overwhelming assault on an army that was expecting a conventional engagement. The Anglo-Saxons marched with the confidence of righteous warriors, expecting a test of strength and courage, a scenario where bravery and martial skill would be rewarded. They were prepared for the clang of steel, the roar of battle cries, and the grim determination of a pitched conflict. What they were not prepared for was the sheer primal terror of being attacked from all sides by an unseen enemy, of arrows raining down from the trees, of the earth seemingly erupting with hostile warriors. This was not a battle. It was a massacre, an extermination conducted with chilling efficiency. The psychological shock of such an experience is profound. It erodes morale, breeds panic, and undermines the very will to fight. Consider the effect of a sudden violent storm on a calm sea. The predictable patterns are shattered, and chaos reigns. The Vikings, by orchestrating this complete inversion of expectations, didn't just defeat the Anglo-Saxon army, they shattered its psychological foundation. They weaponized surprise and terror, turning the invading army's own confidence into a vulnerability. This wasn't merely a tactical victory, it was a profound psychological defeat, demonstrating that the most potent weapon in warfare is often not the sharpest sword but the most deeply unsettled mind. The Viking ambush at Tettenhall was not merely a military engagement, it was a profound demonstration of how a deep understanding of the prevailing cultural currents could be leveraged as a weapon. The Anglo-Saxons, particularly the ruling elite, were deeply invested in a particular vision of kingship and military glory, one that emphasized outward displays of power, formal oaths, and a rigid adherence to established martial traditions. Their armies were often levied from their subjects, composed of men who owed fealty and service, their loyalty often tied to the personal authority and perceived success of their lord. This system, while effective for large-scale territorial defense or expansionist campaigns, created a certain predictability in their approach to warfare. They expected to face a comparable force, to engage in battles of honor where courage and martial prowess would ultimately decide the outcome. Now consider how this played out in the context of Tettenhall. The Vikings didn't just defeat an army, they subverted the very ethos that animated it. By choosing an unconventional, almost clandestine method of engagement, they attacked not just the physical bodies of the warriors, but their fundamental assumptions about warfare. The shock of being hunted like animals, rather than fighting as noble warriors, was a devastating blow to their collective psyche. This wasn't about outmatching their swordsmanship, it was about dismantling their worldview, their belief in a predictable, honorable conflict. The Vikings, through their actions, communicated a potent message, that the old rules no longer applied, and that power could manifest in forms far more insidious and effective than brute force alone. They exploited the Anglo-Saxon adherence to a specific code of conduct by refusing to play by those rules, thereby rendering the Anglo-Saxon strengths irrelevant and their expectations a fatal liability. Furthermore, the very concept of ownership and possession within Anglo-Saxon society played a subtle yet significant role in shaping their military objectives and, consequently, their strategic vulnerabilities. The kings and nobles were fighting to reclaim lands, to reassert their hereditary rights, and to protect their established social order. This focus on territorial integrity and established hierarchies meant their war aims were often tied to specific geographical locations and the maintenance of a particular social structure. Consequently, their military planning tended to be defensive in nature, focused on holding territory and repelling invaders who threatened this status quo. The Vikings, on the other hand, often operated with a more fluid concept of dominion. While they sought to establish settlements and exert influence, their immediate objectives in raids and ambushes were often more opportunistic, focused on acquiring wealth, disrupting enemy infrastructure, or inflicting strategic damage rather than holding specific defined tracts of land in the same way. Building on this, at Tettenhall, the Vikings weren't merely defending their settlements, they were actively shaping the battlefield to their advantage, turning the Anglo-Saxon desire to own and reclaim into a trap. The King's March was a declaration of intent to impose their will and their ownership onto the land. The Vikings responded by demonstrating that they could dictate the terms of engagement on that very land, rendering the Anglo-Saxon claims and their associated military preparations moot. Their ability to strike swiftly and disappear, to control the tempo and location of the conflict, meant that the Anglo-Saxons' desire to hold ground became a disadvantage, forcing them into vulnerable positions. The Vikings' fluidity contrasted sharply with the Anglo-Saxons' rootedness, a difference that proved decisive. Another crucial layer to consider is the impact of leadership styles and the nature of authority within each culture. Anglo-Saxon kingship, while evolving, was still deeply intertwined with personal charisma, the ability to lead from the front, and the expectation that a ruler would share the risks and glories of battle alongside his warriors. This fostered a sense of loyalty and shared purpose, but it also meant that the fate of the army was inextricably linked to the person of the king. If the king was threatened or incapacitated, the entire command structure could falter. The Vikings, while also having chieftains and leaders, often fostered a more decentralized warrior culture, where individual prowess and battlefield initiative were highly valued. While loyalty to a leader was important, it was often coupled with a fierce independence and a commitment to the success of the raid or battle itself, regardless of the immediate fate of a single commander. Consequently, at Tettenhall, when the Anglo-Saxon leadership became the primary target, the entire edifice of their military command began to crumble. The wounding of King Ethelred, and the subsequent chaos as his personal guard fought desperately to protect him, created a vacuum that the Vikings immediately exploited. The Anglo-Saxon army, so reliant on its central leadership, became a rudderless ship in a storm. The Vikings, on the other hand, could absorb losses at a more distributed level, their decentralized structure allowing for continued offensive action even as individual warriors fell. This stark difference in how authority was structured and exercised meant that the targeting of leadership, a classic tactic in conventional warfare, had a far more catastrophic and immediate impact on the Anglo-Saxon force than it would have on a more adaptable Viking warband. The Anglo-Saxon military, deeply embedded within a society that venerated lineage and the ancestral right to rule, operated under a paradigm where legitimacy was intrinsically tied to inherited status and established traditions. Their armies were, in essence, extensions of this social hierarchy, where obedience to those of higher birth was not merely a military imperative, but a societal cornerstone. This meant that when the kings, embodying the apex of this structure, marched into battle, they did so with the expectation that their presence alone would command unwavering loyalty and coordinated action. Their military doctrine, therefore, was built around the concept of a unified front, a cohesive force led by figures of undeniable authority. However, this very structure, designed to maintain order and reinforce social stratification, also created a profound vulnerability, a singular point of failure. Now consider how this applied when confronted by an enemy that operated on entirely different principles. The Vikings, forged in a society where individual prowess, kinship ties, and the ability to command respect through deeds rather than birthright held sway, fostered a more fluid and adaptable military ethos. Their warbands were often formed around personal allegiances and shared objectives, with leaders earning their positions through demonstrated courage and strategic acumen. Consequently, when the Anglo-Saxon leadership was targeted, the entire meticulously constructed edifice of their command structure began to fracture. The wounding of King Ethelred, and the ensuing chaos as his sworn protectors desperately fought to shield him, created an immediate void. This wasn't just the loss of a commander. It was the destabilization of the entire social and military order that the Anglo-Saxons held sacred. The Vikings, by contrast, could absorb such losses more readily. Their decentralized approach meant that even if a chieftain fell, other seasoned warriors could step into the breach. Their authority derived from their demonstrated ability to lead and inspire on the battlefield, not solely from their inherited status. This difference in the very fabric of their leadership meant that the Anglo-Saxon army, so reliant on its central pillar of authority, became a disoriented entity, its carefully coordinated movements devolving into desperate individual struggles for survival. Furthermore, the Anglo-Saxon preoccupation with claiming and holding territory, a direct consequence of their deeply ingrained sense of ownership and hereditary rights, shaped their strategic thinking in ways that ultimately proved detrimental. Their campaigns were often driven by the desire to push back frontiers, to reassert control over lands they considered their patrimony, and to solidify the boundaries of their kingdoms. This focus on fixed territories meant their armies were often committed to advancing along predictable routes, securing occupied ground, and engaging in battles designed to achieve decisive territorial gains. Building upon this, at Tettenhall, the King's March was a bold declaration of intent to impose their dominion, to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. They envisioned a war of attrition, a process of gradually expelling the invaders and re-establishing their ancestral claims. The Vikings, however, operated with a far more fluid and opportunistic understanding of control. Their immediate objectives in raids and ambushes were often less about holding vast tracts of land and more about inflicting maximum disruption, acquiring plunder, and demonstrating their capacity to dictate the terms of engagement. Their ability to strike swiftly, melt back into the landscape, and reappear elsewhere rendered the Anglo-Saxon desire to hold ground a significant liability. The invaders found themselves committed to advancing. Their lines of communication stretched thin, their forces spread out, all while the Vikings, unburdened by the need to secure fixed positions, could choose when and where to strike. This fundamental divergence in strategic philosophy, the Anglo-Saxon commitment to static territorial control versus the Viking mastery of fluid, hit-and-run tactics, transformed the planned invasion into a devastating trap. The very land the Anglo-Saxons sought to possess became the instrument of their undoing, a testament to how a deep-seated cultural value, when misapplied in a given context, can become a fatal flaw. Another critical aspect to consider is the Anglo-Saxon societal emphasis on formal oaths and the sacredness of sworn testimony, a practice deeply interwoven with their legal and military systems. When warriors swore fealty to a king or an ealdorman, it was a binding commitment, often accompanied by religious solemnity and the understanding of dire consequences for betrayal. This created a strong sense of obligation and loyalty within their ranks, fostering a cohesive military unit when led effectively. However, this very reliance on formalized commitments could also breed a degree of inflexibility. Their military planning often assumed that these oaths would hold, that the hierarchical bonds would remain unbroken even under extreme duress. Conversely, Viking society, while valuing loyalty, often placed a greater emphasis on the pragmatic outcomes of actions and the personal bonds forged through shared experience and mutual benefit. While oaths were made, their enforcement was often more dependent on the demonstrated strength and success of the leader and the continued goodwill of the warband, rather than an abstract, immutable code. Consequently, at Tettenhall, when the initial shock of the ambush shattered the Anglo-Saxon formations and plunged the army into disarray, the formal structure of their oaths began to unravel. The breakdown of central command meant that the very individuals to whom oaths were sworn were either incapacitated or inaccessible. In such extreme circumstances, where survival became the paramount concern, the abstract weight of a formal oath could begin to diminish in comparison to the immediate visceral need for self-preservation. While the core of the Anglo-Saxon army fought valiantly to uphold their vows, the ensuing chaos created opportunities for those less bound by such rigid structures to prioritize escape, leading to the widespread disintegration of the organized force. The Vikings, by exploiting this inherent tension between formal obligation and the primal instinct for survival, were able to capitalize on the psychological fragmentation that ensued, turning the very system designed to ensure Anglo-Saxon unity into a catalyst for its collapse. Reflecting on this journey so far, we have traversed the shadowed valleys of ambition and the sun-drenched peaks of perceived invincibility, only to witness the swift, decisive turn of fortune's wheel. The echoes of regal pronouncements and the gleam of meticulously polished armor now fade, replaced by the potent silence that follows a profound unraveling. We have seen how the most formidable structures built upon foundations of assured superiority can be subtly undermined, their very strengths transmuted into vulnerabilities by an adversary who understands the deeper currents of conflict. The grand designs of kings etched with certainty upon the maps of their desires met an unforeseen resistance, not merely of brute force, but of a more elemental understanding of the world, a profound attunement to the pulse of the land itself. As we pivot towards the final reflection, consider the convergence of these disparate elements, the arrogant certainty of established power meeting the patient, adaptive cunning of those who operate beyond its rigid boundaries. The meticulously planned march, intended to assert dominion, became a conduit for its very undoing, each step forward a closer embrace of the meticulously laid trap. This is not merely a chronicle of a single battle, but a testament to the enduring principles that govern the rise and fall of empires, the interplay of hubris and humility, and the profound impact of understanding the terrain, both physical and psychological, upon which destiny is forged. The tapestry woven thus far reveals a pattern where the most overt displays of strength can be rendered impotent by a more nuanced, yet devastatingly effective approach. The insights gleaned from this ancient narrative resonate with a timeless truth, hinting at the enduring lessons embedded within the very fabric of human conflict and the nature of true strategic mastery. The stage is now set for a final contemplation, a distillation of the enduring wisdom that emerges from the crucible of such a decisive encounter. Thus, the fields of Tettenhall, once vibrant with the promise of a royal dawn, were stained by the brutal reality of ambition unchecked. The narrative arc of this ancient clash culminates not merely in the grim tally of fallen warriors, but in a profound revelation about the very nature of power and perception. The Anglo-Saxon kings, so certain of their righteous cause and the invincibility of their amassed might, marched into a carefully orchestrated silence, a stillness that was far more terrifying than any war cry. They believed that the strength of their lineage, the divine favor they invoked, and the sheer weight of their legions were sufficient to banish the Norse presence. Yet, their carefully constructed edifice of authority, built on the bedrock of inherited right and formal oaths, proved brittle against an enemy that understood the land with an intimacy that transcended maps and decrees. The Vikings, in their patient observation and their refusal to adhere to the expected rules of engagement, demonstrated that true mastery lies not in the imposition of will, but in the subtle manipulation of circumstance. They understood that the most devastating blows are often struck not in the open field, but in the hidden glades, not with overwhelming force, but with perfectly timed precision. The core message that resonates from this saga is the perilous illusion of certainty. The king's unwavering conviction in their victory, their failure to perceive the enemy's deeper strategy, serves as an eternal cautionary tale. It whispers that the loudest pronouncements and the most formidable appearances can mask profound vulnerabilities, and that the most profound wisdom often resides not in proclaimed authority, but in silent observation and adaptive action. The land itself, seemingly a passive stage for the Anglo-Saxon advance, became an active participant in the Viking strategy, a testament to the power of knowing one's environment intimately. This clash was more than a mere military encounter. It was a profound philosophical divergence, a stark illustration of how deeply ingrained cultural values, whether the sanctity of lineage or the pragmatic adaptability of the warrior, can shape the very outcome of conflict. The legacy of Tettenhall is not just the memory of a devastating ambush, but a timeless reminder that true strength often lies in understanding not only your own capabilities, but the deeper currents of your adversary's world, and the subtle, often unseen forces that truly govern the tides of fortune. The true practice begins now, to look beyond the surface of power, to listen to the silences, and to understand that the most strategic victories are often won not by marching forward, but by waiting, watching, and knowing precisely when and where to strike.